In early 2017, Yolanda Bako, then age 71, attended a women's history conference at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville. While walking to an elevator, Miss Bako tripped over the base of an art installation that had been left in the hallway. She fell to the ground and fractured her right hip. A day later, she underwent surgery to repair her hip. The college immediately blamed Miss Bako for the fall, writing a report that said she wasn't paying attention, that the art piece was out of the walking path, even though these assertions contradicted the account of an eyewitness.
And she wasn't just, a random person who was coming to attend the conference. This was a woman who had returned to the school many times over the decades. This was a woman who was at the school in the 1970s for this program to found their PhD in women's studies. She was one of the pioneers that helped them establish their program in women's studies at the outset. Yolanda is a woman who, when she was younger, in the 1970s, was very active in the women's rights movement. She was a pioneer in the women's movement early on. She co-founded the first clinic in New York State to protect battered women, the first shelter for battered women. Back at that time, Central Park was not safe. It was not a place where women felt safe to be in, to walk in, even during the daytime. And Yolanda felt that that was not right. And she organized a march in Central Park where thousands of women gathered and marched in Central Park to reclaim the night. And that was the beginning of Take Back the Night. That's where it all comes from. And that it was Yolanda's idea, and it was covered in the media, including in the New York Times. She was instrumental in a lot of the early activities in the women's rights movement in New York State in the 1970s. Around 1978, she went to Sarah Lawrence College along with a bunch of other women who were active in the women's rights movement at that time, because Sarah Lawrence was creating a PhD program specifically in women's studies. And the way they were creating this PhD program was to have a 2-week retreat for all of these women to be at the college and take a bunch of classes and have a lot of conversations around women's issues, which was sort of the genesis of the PhD program in women's studies. And that was the beginning of her connection to Sarah Lawrence College. As I got to know her and as I spent more time on the case and learned about her history, I thought that this was an incredible woman who had a tremendous history, but her story hadn't really been told. And all these years later, she was living alone, and I've had this sense that time had kind of passed her by and people had forgotten who she was and what she'd accomplished. We knew right away that when she fell, she broke her right hip. And we knew that the first surgery hadn't gone well for her. The bones hadn't fused, and she needed a replacement of the hip a few months after the first surgery. And she told us from the outset that after that first surgery on the right hip, she developed a terrible incontinence problem, and that made her time in the hospital and her time in the 2 rehabs incredibly difficult, because in addition to being immobile, in addition to recovering from a fractured hip and a surgery that ultimately failed, she couldn't hold her bladder. And one of the things that we learned, and we ultimately presented later in the trial of the case, is that the one thing you need when you have bladder control issues, when you're incontinent, is the ability to walk, is mobility, is the ability to get to the bathroom and to move around. And she didn't have that. And so she had a terribly difficult time in the weeks and the months and ultimately the years after the initial injury, dealing with both the orthopedic injuries and the limitations they imposed, along with the incontinence and the terrible logistical and difficult problems of managing that when she wasn't very mobile. Right from the beginning, the college blamed her for the incident. And right from the beginning in the lawsuit, there was a sense that they were blaming her age and her pre-existing problems related to age on whatever her claims were, namely that she had limitations from the injury. It was pretty clear to us that the injuries not only caused her a lot of great suffering, but they had significantly changed her life. As much as she was an older person with a whole bunch of health problems, she was independent, she was mobile, and she was able to do her activities, go to events, live on her own. She rode her bike frequently. She loved to get out of the city and see nature and do things outside the Bronx. And all of that was taken away from her after the injury, after the accident. And so there was a significant change in her life from the injuries, from the incident. And instead of acknowledging that, the defense in the case sought, I think from the very beginning, to blame her age and to blame her pre-existing arthritis on her problems, rather than acknowledge that the incident and the injuries that resulted and the complications from the surgery, I think that she was mistreated after the incident insofar as they blamed her for the whole thing happening, and having to go through the entire litigation process that unfolded over a period of years where she was sort of put on trial. And it was a dynamic of blaming the victim that unfolded. And I thought that that was unfair, and it was the opposite of what she needed. She didn't have a lot of people around her. She didn't have a support system. And her life was difficult enough. And then to have to deal with all the impacts of the injury and the treatment that she underwent, and to do it alone was difficult for her. And have to face, on top of that, the backdrop of the lawsuit and the stress that's associated with that was, an added and difficult burden for her. The insurance companies make as much of an effort as they can to kind of dehumanize the plaintiff or take that human element out of the case. They don't want us telling the story of who our client was before the incident and the life they led and the relationships they had. They want it to be on a different level, talking about medical treatment and tests and doctors, and not so much about the human story that's behind it. And so we make an effort to shift the landscape, in part at least, to tell the human story and make sure that's not forgotten. Because at the end of the day, representing real people and their suffering is human suffering. And when one of our clients suffers an injury that is either disabling or life-changing or both, it is the human story of who they are and the life they've led before the incident and how the incident has changed their life that is the context, is the setting for describing the injuries and the impact of the injuries. And so without the larger life story, without the human element, without the background, you can't do the job effectively. As we approached trial, it became clear to us that the insurance company had evaluated the case in such a way where they were not taking account for Yolanda's suffering, for how her life had changed, about the enormity of the impact on her from the injuries and the treatment that resulted. And it was clear that they weren't going to value the case at an appropriate sum and that we were going to have to go to trial. Sarah Lawrence College was not going to be involved in any kind of direct way, that they had ceded control of the lawsuit and the trial to their insurance company. And it was completely within the decision-making and the purview of the insurance company to defend the case as they saw fit. Not just whether or not to settle it or whether to settle it for one number versus a number, but what the strategy would be at trial in terms of defending the case. And it also became clear that the strategy of the insurance company was to blame Yolanda for everything. Blame her for the incident, blame her for her injuries, and to blame her age and her other pre-existing health problems on what we said were big changes in her life after the incident from the injuries.
There wasn't much that they could really do because it was pretty clear cut. She tripped over the object because the object was in the way. And they tried to do everything that they could to try to discredit Ms. Bako, the floor, the lighting, anything that they could have thrown in there to make it seem like it was her fault, but it was obviously just a trip and fall.
This is something that we commonly see. We see it in litigation and we see it at trial. The standard defense from the insurance companies is to blame the plaintiff. And the reason they're doing that is because they know there's a stereotype out there that oftentimes people are too quick to sue, and there's a lot of people who take advantage of the civil justice system and make claims that may not be entirely on the level or exaggerated.
I think that their job was harder because they didn't have a solid argument. It felt a lot of the time that they were trying to discredit Yolanda Bako and all of the other witnesses that came on the stand to defend her.
And so they play into that stereotype by attempting to demonize our clients and blame them for everything, blame them for the accent, and blame them for the injuries and the way the injuries have changed and impacted their lives. If the client has some history of having been involved in some kind of prior trauma or accident, even if it's something on the sporting field from years before, they'll blame that as the reason for their problem. When you go through trial, in the run up to trial and then at trial, you get to know the clients really, really well.
When I first saw the dynamic between Steve Williamson and Yolanda Bako, I thought that it was like a very personal relationship. He seemed to really have a lot of compassion towards her. And the way that he spoke about her, it seemed like they had developed a close relationship to the point where he was defending like a close friend of his.
As much as you may have spent years with them before over the life of the litigation, as much as you may have spent a lot of time with them before trial, the process of trial and the process of preparing them to come to court and to testify is very intense, and it happens over a relatively short period of time. So there's a bond and a closeness that develops between the lawyer and the client. When you have that bond, there's a personal connection that develops. And then when you see the lawyers for the defense attacking your client and mischaracterizing their life and mischaracterizing their actions and blaming them for things that they didn't do or they didn't have a hand in, it affects you because you're deeply invested in the client's life. You're steeped in their story, and you've gotten so close to them in all the preparations and all the time you're spending together that an attack on the client is almost like an attack on you. You sort of become one in that way. And it's not that you're taking it personally, but you're personally invested in the mission.
If you think about it, she's an older woman and she's responsible for a lot of really amazing things that have happened in our country, whether it's the library or the Take Back the Night March, which I've personally participated in on my own college campus.
There were a number of instances over the course of the trial where we had certain witnesses on the stand, and there were moments where it seemed like the truth was really coming out in a way that the jury could appreciate. Not just about how the incident happened, but that there had been an effort on behalf of the college to really blame our client for the whole incident and everything that transpired immediately afterward without any real basis for doing so. It became clear that there was an effort right away to sort of cover themselves and blame our client for the incident. And as we began to show that for what it was, expose it, we had a sense that the tide was turning.
When we heard from the event coordinator from Sarah Lawrence and the security guard and the head of security, it just seemed very out there, like a stretch. Like the event planner and the head of security were kind of in cahoots to try to make it seem like, oh, it's just a senior citizen and she tripped and fell and it was her fault. But like things weren't adding up in the most like tangible way. So like this artifact causes this woman to fall, and somehow the next day the student decides she wants to destroy it. It doesn't really add up, you know? And things started to seem a little fishy. And on the stand, the event coordinator, she wasn't the most reliable. You could tell she was getting a little choked up on her words, and I felt like she was working really hard to defend herself, which was odd for someone that has already left Sarah Lawrence. The same thing with the head of security. They had all already left their employment. So it seemed like a plot, and they were in cahoots, and they weren't trying to take any responsibility. And it makes sense, you know, you don't want to have to raise anybody's tuition, but it just didn't feel credible.
How Mr. Williamson approached the witnesses, how Mr. Williamson, the information that he provided ahead of time. I think it was really important that he put everything out there about Ms. Bako. I think that was extremely important, just because, you know, she was an older lady, and, you know, he mentioned that so many times. Look, you know, she's had a million problems. She's been in the medical offices for years, for decades. At one point in the trial, he grabbed a whole box full of papers and dropped it, and, like, you know, it was like there was, you know, he seemed honest, and, you know, attorneys can seem deceiving at many times. He seemed to be a sincere attorney who's representing a client as if it were his own mother. And I personally, I appreciated that. You know, I found it to be, a touching point. It was like, let's put everything out there. We have nothing to hide. It is what it is. This is how we're going to fight this case. This is how we're going to introduce it. And he laid everything out, things that could have gone against him, but he still put it out there. And, I'm certain that that's what got him that decision unanimously.
From the outset of the trial, we tried to send a clear signal to the jury that we were going to try and be as honest with them and as forthright with them as we could be in every respect of the case, in every aspect of the case, whether it was something that was positive for us or might be perceived as negative for us, or something that the defense was making hay about. We're going to lay it all out there in an honest way for them to see so that they could make their own judgment. And as the trial continued and progressed, that approach stood in stark contrast to the approach of the defense, which we felt was something less than forthright, something less than completely honest, and was advancing arguments that were meant to blame our client and avoid responsibility, even though they didn't square with the facts.
The issue that I had with the lawyers from Sarah Lawrence was that they just didn't seem like they bought into the case fully. Like they had just shown up because they were the ones chosen for that case and they were trying to work with what they had, but they didn't really have much. I think that they tried to do the best that they could with what they had, but they didn't have much. I think as a jury, we decided that we might have looked at this from a different angle if they had taken like partial responsibility for what happened, but they tried to put everything on this elderly woman, and it was like, no way. Like, this is a little ridiculous.
I think Mr. Williamson was very consistent. He is a chess player.
We were talking about it as a collective, and we just kept saying, like, chess, not checkers. You could tell that he was very thorough in his planning, and he was very aware of all of the witnesses, all of the doctors.
He asked the right questions. They, forced him to give an honest answer. That's how kind of it cleared the smoke from our heads.
It's never possible to know what a jury's going to do. Any lawyer who tells you that they know for sure what a jury's going to do during trial is just blowing smoke. But over time, over years and decades of trying cases, you can get a sense of how the winds are blowing. You can develop some ability to read the tea leaves. And I have a whole team with me when I try a case. I have folks at the counsel table who are part of my team. I have people in the courtroom who are watching the jury, watching the witnesses, watching the whole dynamic and the vibe in the courtroom, so that we can have the best sense possible before the jury actually deliberates and decides the case of which way they may be going.
Some of the other factors that the jury considered before reaching their decision were the testimonies from the different doctors. There was a point where Steve Williamson was going back and forth with, I want to say, the orthopedist for the defense, and he was trying his best to prove that the arthritis and things that Ms. Bako had already had were kind of aggravated, separate from the incident. And it just, like, we looked at the x-rays, we looked at the MRIs, we looked at all of these supporting medical documents, and it just wasn't adding up. And then when we talked about the life care planners, the fact that the life care planner only factored in 2 diapers a day for Ms. Bako felt unjust, because if you think about like a baby or an elderly person, you're going through more than 2 diapers a day. So to try to give this woman the bare minimum after all of the suffering that she went through with all the surgeries and the injuries and the pain and the procedures and the urinary incontinence, it just, at that point, it felt offensive to us. So we were just like, all right, we're over this. We know exactly what we're gonna do.
When a jury comes in with their verdict, it's always a tense moment filled with anxiety. We always make sure that our client is in the courtroom so that the jury can see the client is there when the decision's being rendered, when it's being publicly made. And there's enormous anxiety, I know, that the client has waiting. They've never been through anything like this before. It's almost like out of a movie. And for the lawyer, no matter how many times you've done it, it's always a moment of high tension. When the jury came back in this case with a great result for our client, it was a real sense of vindication that we had, that our client had, and that our whole team had. It is enormously gratifying for the client, and it's so special for us to see that happen and to see the impact. It's sort of like a wave that comes over the client in segments, because it's not something that they can digest immediately or in an instant. We were able to draw a stark contrast with the defense and really show the jury that the defense was blaming her to avoid paying for the harm that they caused, not because they had a legitimate basis to do so.
The defendant's attorneys were good, but they were outmatched with Mr. Williamson. I didn't know, what they were trying to do with that information that was given. They were dragging and beating the dead horse regarding, Miss Bako being or having a medical history, having arthritis.
The jury understood that and got that going into the end of the case. And so when the jury came back with their verdict and they awarded a total of $10 million to her, more than we asked for, I think it was a tremendous vindication of how we presented the case.
We didn't have to deliberate for that long. We sat with it because we wanted to make sure that we were giving her the best figures possible. The fact that they're able to quantify someone's lifespan is a little scary.
Now, with the positive results at trial and with the money that she's getting from the case, it's something she desperately needs. And this money is going to enable her to have a high quality of care in the home to really improve her quality of life.
So we wanted to make sure that we were getting it right for the timing that she does have left, because they were very specific, like 12.1 years, and that's all you got, girl. So we knew after a certain point, like, all right, this is it, but we definitely wanted to make sure we got it right.
We analyzed every detail, we paid attention. I think it was an extremely diverse jury.
It takes days for them to realize that the case is over and that they've won, and that this group of strangers who they've been in a courtroom with for a period of weeks has affirmed their story and was on their side and has given them justice.
100%. That the correct verdict is what came out.
We got an opportunity to speak to the jurors afterwards, because after the jury is done with their deliberations, after they've rendered their verdict under the New York rules, they can speak. They're free to speak to the lawyers and anybody that they want about the case. All those prohibitions about not speaking to lawyers, not speaking to the parties are gone. And I always take the opportunity to speak to the jurors, because you want to learn what was effective, what wasn't effective, what they liked, what they believed, what they didn't like. I always encourage jurors to be as candid with me as possible.
Just thorough argument, very good. I would absolutely recommend him. We all rushed to get his business card at the end, because we were like, that's the lawyer we want if something happens.
I definitely wanted that business card, and I definitely said, you know what, God forbid, but if I ever need, or if my family ever needs an attorney, this is going to be the guy.
And this jury, after this verdict, was just so effusive in their embrace of her, of Yolanda, and of the case. And they were really with us. They believed the case, they believed her, they believed the story. The jury is a representation of the Bronx. The jury is a representation of Yolanda's peers. The jury is a representation of the community.
Miss Bako, she's an amazing, strong woman. Resembles a lot like my grandmother. It was really nice to know in depth what she did and what she did for her community. It's good to just listen and hear what she's done in her tenure while she was, an advocate for women's rights.
She talked about how she created the Battered Women's Shelter, and I've done the Take Back the Night March and all of these things. And it's just really beautiful to see someone who's dedicated their entire life to the cause.
It's a vindication of the righteousness of the system, the civil justice system, that juries get it, they get it right, they see through the bogus arguments, they see through the smoke screens, respect the jury, and give them all the information and not try and shade the facts or withhold information, the more likely the jury is not only going to get it right, but they're going to be inclined to come to your side of the case.
This experience did change my perspective on the legal system. I mean, as a school teacher, I am privy to everything that Black and brown people go through and systemic oppression and things of that nature. So we kind of have this internalized distrust of the legal system and authority, but seeing someone who's really fought for the rights of others get exactly what they deserved, it felt like poetic justice.
I was raised, in a humble, poor family, middle class, poor family, which for us, money isn't everything. Within my community and within my family, sometimes we suffer things and we go through things and we kind of neglect reporting and neglect actually suing someone. But you know what? If someone is negligent, you should be compensated for it.